So, kia ora koutou, welcome. My name's Frida Wells, and I'm the Communications Advisor for the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee. So, it is my honour today to host Emily King, a food systems expert and founder of Spira NZ, for this webinar, which is titled Refood, the title of her book, A Healthy Approach to Aotearoa's Troubled Food System. Emily King is a former environmental lawyer who went on to study and work in the food systems abroad before returning to Aotearoa and founding Spira in 2017. She was named one of Food Tank's top 20 global food leaders under 40 for her work restoring New Zealand's food system. She judged the Outstanding New Zealand Food Producer Awards sustainability category for 6 years and helped set up the Kitchen Project, Kai Waiheke, and recently facilitated the New Zealand Government's Food Summit Dialogues in the lead up to the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021. And today she'll be talking us through the concepts in her book. And I just wanted to also mention one of the key reasons that we are hosting Emily on this webinar today is one of the projects in the Leadership Committee's work program is the Regional Food System Strategy being led by Tessa Acker at Te Whatu Order. And I just want to make a mention that this is a key project, the positive benefits of which are interconnected with all of our other projects, whether they're in climate, housing, transport, or the economy. And so as we look closer at our 18 projects, we see that the system shifts required to ensure a positive outcome in them. For example, a healthy food system would actually bring positive outcomes in all other areas, whether transport, housing, climate, or economy. And so when we look at these interdependencies, at the information that we tend to push to the edges of the story of each project, at those boundaries, it sort of helps us to lift up our thinking to that holistic view, really focusing on relationships as a KPI. And I just want to give a nod to Tessa Acker, who's done an amazing job of really focusing on listening to all people in the food system and centering the health of our food system around people and the environment in her strategy. So keep an eye on that project as the story of it sort of unfolds and we do more engagement. Without further ado, it's my honour to hand over to Emily. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Frida. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Emily King taku ingoa, e te puaki, e raro, e taranaki, ko Waiheke, toku kāinga and nine name. Morena, everyone. Thank you for joining this morning. Thank you, Frida, for the introduction and for having me here. It's a great honour to speak to you about food systems and acknowledging the work that you've already done in this space with Tessa and others, looking at the wider Wellington regional food strategy, which is to be really commended. It's, as you know, not a light undertaking to look at things in depth and to take a food systems approach, which so far I think has been happening in your region. So well done for doing that. It's really needed these days and it's a big undertaking. So I thought this morning I would just talk to you a little bit about my book that I wrote, Refood, as you saw in Frida's slide at the start, the cover. And then I'll probably have a little bit of time at the end to answer questions. So, and if you want to go deeper into questions and things like that, then we can also go and have a separate talk about that another time. But we'll just keep it on the bigger topic of refood and food systems today. So I'll just give you a little bit of background. You heard a little introduction about me from Frida. And well, I have worked in food systems for about a decade, but I guess about 3.5 years ago, I started to really feel like there needed to be more out there for people to access and understand about what that topic is. It's quite a complex topic, as many of you, if you're working in that, you'll know. And so it started to bubble up inside me that there was a desire to write a book. I really enjoy writing as an outlet of my thoughts, and I decided to channel that into a book, which of course, as you'll remember, around that time, we also had COVID hit us, and a lot of the topics that had been marginalised and pushed outwards on the food system really came to the fore for the global population. The lens of resiliency began to creep in again around food, and we saw all of those things happen with food supply chains being affected by COVID. We also saw our food workers being put really on the front line to try and get food to people. And New Zealand fared relatively well in that, but globally we saw the loss of many, many people through the food system in that regard as well as livestock and many other implications. So COVID really brought it out. And through all this, I was meanwhile putting down my thoughts about food systems change. So coming out the other side of that and fast forwarding to now, the time is quite different in a way. A lot of those thoughts that came up for people in COVID have already sort of slipped the mind. And now at the fore is the concepts of things like New Zealand being at a 36-year food price high, and the cost of living, and how we can feed the 1 in 5 children that don't have access to food in our country. And of course, these topics were all there underneath and bubbling away throughout the pandemic. And then we had some really big global things happen, like Russia invading Ukraine, which really has affected the price of wheat and the supply of food to many countries in the world that are completely reliant on that grain bowl for their daily sustenance. So we're seeing really big issues globally around food supply, as well as the rise of prices, and then of course climate change. So these are all the things that are in the backdrop here. And so Food has landed right at this time. But I must say, as a thought leader and observer of the system for a decade, there's always something going on in food. And so even if it wasn't that, there would have been something else that the book landed in amongst. But what it's meant is that a lot of people have shown interest in the topic. And I mean, I knew that, that's why I wrote the book, but also it's been taken up. Media have shown a lot of interest, and there's been a lot of coverage lately around this topic of the food system. And so, okay, so I just thought I'd start where I always start. I'm a visual person, and this is in my book. Thank you for those of you who have read it and seen this or heard me talk about it before. You'll be familiar with the Spiro food system wheel. I designed this about 6 years ago, fed up with not finding the right depiction of the food system for myself as I explained it to people. Usually it omits the environment, which really frustrates me. This also omits Indigenous people and their food systems, which also frustrates me. But what I'm depicting here is the conventional industrialized global food system and how it works internationally, because that's the food system that we operate in, and that causes all of the challenges, but also all of the potential solutions that we can find here. So the food system, I've broken it down into the environment, which is where it all begins: soil, water, air; production, which is our farmers and growers; manufacturing, which is our food processors and food makers; selling, or at the supply time, that's our retailers, our supermarkets and stores; and then eating, which is where people do or do not get access to food. And across there is food waste that comes off pretty much all parts apart from the environment, and also transport and logistics. So I just wanted to show you this so that when I'm saying our food system, or you hear that term, that's what people are talking about. There's also political, trade, economics, and cultural and community and health that layer over the top of that, which makes for, a really complex beast. But it's also a lot of fun. There's a lot of solutions in there, and there's a lot of great things that can happen within that food system. Now, my talk today isn't training you on the food system, but I did want to just start there because it's the core structure of my book. I used this as the basis of how I wrote the book. And so the book is in 3 parts: Grow, Make, and Nourish, looking at the challenges really that we see, but also solutions. So in growing, I look at soil, waterways, and climate change. In Make, I look at food waste and packaging. And in Nourish, I look at healthy food and access to food. And so across all of those different parts, we see how our food system can really help us or hinder us these days. And so this is my structure really of the book. And for anybody who has an interest in writing, particularly New Zealand nonfiction, which is the category that the book falls into, there's a real gap there. So there's a gap in terms of what we've written about in our country, in our country's history, our country's story, how we got to where we are today, why we are as a food producing nation. And these are the interesting topics that I delve into. And I find it quite fascinating to look at these things, because obviously food is cultural, there's a social side to it, not only the food business or the food supply chain. So yeah, that's the gap, I guess, that the book is filling, and that's where people are finding it interesting because, they've wondered about this. I also wanted to take the food system from an abstract concept that no one really gets and bring it to the fore, give it an image, which I'm now going to just stop sharing, give it a visualization for people so that people can actually see what we're talking about. And professionals like yourselves who are faced with decision making or information coming across your desk, and you're hearing terms like food system and you think it might be jargony, and what is this next thing? Is this like regeneration or sustainability or whatever the next buzzword is? I just wanted to give this complex and incredible system a real voice and place because it deserves it. And so that's where ReFood sits. And when I was writing it, I actually found some parts quite surprising. I found packaging in particular and waste in our country a real challenge to clearly communicate to readers and myself, even as an expert in the topic, to get my head around what we're really doing or not doing around that topic. And so as consumers of food yourselves, you'll probably be able to relate to some of those frustrations. And so that was also a challenge. The other one that I found insightful and also challenging was looking in health around food environments and just how much the role of food environments, how big their role is in how we shape our food systems. And public health people in the audience will be very aware of this. But I think that people generally, the wider community, don't get this. People don't understand how much our food environments, which is the physical spaces, whether that's our urban planning or our supermarket layout or the absence or presence of supermarkets or takeaways, or some of our policies that enable unhealthy food environments. These sorts of things, I really found that quite confronting, how much that sort of has a silent hand in how things are playing out for people. And so that's in there. To help get our heads around this, because often people think, well, I don't have a big part to play in the food system, but actually you might be an urban planner, or you might be a marketer, or you might be a designer, and you do. You might not have realized that. You might not work for a food business, but you actually have a part to play in this system. And the people that can make a difference are actually maybe more of them than you realize out there to help you. But the other thing I thought I would mention is back to the book itself. I actually also think that there's a real role these days for a physical book, or if it's on your Kindle or whatever, fine. But we just have a big scroll culture of like really short snippets of information, bite-sized chunks that come through. And I really am an advocate for people that have a really complex topic to just sit down quietly and really read and think about it, because this click culture and all of this information, it's not serving us well. And so I just thought also a book is a great way to understand a really complicated topic if you can just take your time and go through it. Because as I say in the book, it is big and there is overwhelm when you're getting your head around food systems change. And so you actually need a little bit of quiet space to acknowledge some of those thoughts, and especially if you're working in the topic. I've worked with professionals on food systems change for a decade, and I've worked with them on some pretty big crunchy projects, and I've seen this. And I know that if we have that food system wheel in our mind and we work out how we can weave those pieces together, how we can talk interdepartmentally or across different sectors and silos, we can actually make some really huge differences. But to get there, we have to go through a little journey ourselves in that topic. Frida, I'm not sure how we're going for time. Do you think I should potentially read a little bit, or I don't know, what do you think? Would you rather?
We've got sort of another 40 minutes, so there's definitely
okay.
If you want to go for another 10 at least, we've got heaps of time.
Okay, great. That's good. It's always good to check. I think I might read a little bit from the book. Yeah, if people feel like if you've got a coffee or a cup of tea there, get a bit of morning reading. Don't normally do that at work, do we? But you can today. Okay, so this is right at the end of my book, the conclusion, in fact. And bear with me for those who have read before, but you can turn the hermeneutic circle and have another go at it. So this is called Weaving the Kete Together, and by this time I've finished going through all the aspects of the food system and I'm pulling it together. And I think actually for some people it's a nice place to start, especially if you're new to food systems change. Weaving the Kete Together. We've traversed miles of our country, visiting growers, farmers, food workers, businesses, and community-based food initiatives who are working hard to grow good, healthy food that is better for our health and our planet. We've seen the food system go from microorganisms in the soil through to food in people's tummies. We've learned about the equipment and processes that are needed to make food, transport it, and store it. And we've seen how it goes from a plant to an animal or product and then is transformed into something completely different that then results in food. The food system is nothing short of miraculous. It feeds billions of people, grows incredible varieties of foods, and keeps us alive. I believe in the food system and its ability to do that. But I've also seen the impacts of it on waterways, soils, and most recently, our climate. That's resulted in massive changes to land use, biodiversity, and also cultures. If the goal of the food system is to feed people, we're falling well short of that. Food security is access to affordable, safe, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food. Access, affordable, safe, nutritious. We've discussed these separately. With the exception of safety, we fall short on all of them. We need to get ourselves out of the situation where we have people who are food insecure, to shift towards a way where people are fed and the food is good. To ensure that our farmers and growers are paid well and their products are well respected for the good goods they are, and that those businesses are involved and on board for changes that need to take place to ensure better practices that lead to longevity of their lands for future generations to use. To respect our Indigenous culture, Te Ao Māori, and ensure it's integrated into any changes that we make. To reframe why we make food and expand the food havens in our communities while ensuring we're valuing the work and workers, paying workers well instead of volunteerism. To make sure that we are feeding our own people with the resources we have while continuing to grow food to send abroad. To do these things takes courage, leadership, and vision. Dots need to be joined. The food system needs to be reconnected. The food system needs a voice, a name. It needs to come out of the shadows and into the light. You now know what it is, and it will have different meanings and take a different shape based on your worldview and upbringing for each of you. Regardless, knowing what it is the first step. Then, work out your sphere of influence within that system, at work, in your household, your school, your marae or hapu, your business. From there, it's unpacking where you can make changes within that sphere of influence. That might be very small and close to home with your citizen purchasing power at your local supermarket, or you might make the shift in your workplace that is a large sheep and beef station or a government health department or a restaurant. As you go through this journey of change making in the food system, keep shining the light into the corners and keep asking questions. The food system is a beast, and a lot of the times it is a giant international corporate beast with hands and fingertips in many places. It's also sneaky. It camouflages itself where you least expect it. You might turn the food package over and raise an eyebrow when you realize your little local food producer is actually a subsidiary of a large corporate multinational food business, or you might not have realized food environments are causing your local community some serious issues. Food environments need illumination and change, as do our land use and waste practices. We need creativity and we need passionate people who are willing to step out and do things differently. You are those people. I do believe we can make the changes needed for our food system, improving soil and waterways, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving and reducing packaging, eliminating food waste, making food accessible and healthy for all. But it's going to take a lot of dedicated people to do it. Are you with me? That's the end of the book, actually. So I thought I would just end there and I can answer questions you've got.
I mean, that was such a beautiful passage. I think you chose it so well. And I, for one, now want to go and buy your book. And I do want to mention that our director couldn't be here today, but she bought your book, she read it, and she loved it, Kim Kelly. So
thank you.
I've just mentioned that for her.
Oh, great. Thanks, Kim. You can get it from any bookshops or the library. Libraries have it. And if they don't, you can just get them to order it in. That's how it works. Or you can buy it online. And if you buy it online and you buy it from me, then you get a nice signed copy and I send it out to you. Or you can get it from Amazon for your Kindle. All options.
Nice, thank you. And while you were speaking, clearly it was working because the questions poured in. So do you want to go from the top in the chat or do you want me to sort of read them?
I just read them out actually, Freda. I find that a little easier.
I'm just going to start from the top. Sally Faisandia has asked, what is your perspective on Māori food models? Is there one which you think is the most important?
Thank you. That is a great question. There are a number, and one that I refer to in the book and that I'm most familiar with is the Huaparakore system. And this is a framework, for want of a better English word, I guess, for applying Te Ao Māori principles to the food system. And we have a lot of people practicing that in their food businesses and operations. It's equivalent also of, it's in the background for the Te Wakakai Ora Māori Organics framework certification as well. But it's worth exploring if you're interested in that. And we have some amazing people across our country, including Dr. Jessica Hutchings, who's in your area, and she is a leader in that mahi. Yeah, so that's one. There are more, and I think it's about finding the right fit for the project or the people or the food business, really.
Thank you. So next question we have, again, Sally. Have you addressed the impact of refrigerants or HFCs in the book?
No, I haven't gone into that.
Yeah. Can you talk, you don't have to go on for long on this one, but can you talk about different dietary options in relation to climate change?
Well, every single food has an impact, every single food. And some, if you want to use the lens of climate change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions equivalents, then some have a higher impact on climate change specifically, and some have less. So a rule of thumb is that the further up the food chain you are, the more of an impact you have. So, for example, red meat has a higher impact than all of the foods, but then there's some anomalies in there, like rice, for example, emits a lot of methane in the production of it, so it's actually quite a high impact plant food in relation to other things. There's a whole chapter in my book on it. It's very complex. I don't tell people what they should eat. That's their choice and how they want to eat it. But what I do say is that the food system framing gives you an interesting lens on this topic, because there's a lot to consider when you're coming up with these choices. And if you just have one lens, which is, say, health, like you want to only eat a certain way for health reasons, some people don't have a choice. They have to eat only a certain way for health reasons, of course. But for those who are privileged enough to make choices around what they can and can't eat, that's one lens, just as it is for climate change. So there is a lot of things that go into the wider consideration. For example, foods have a high water usage as well, embedded in them. They have a high water footprint. There's also obviously the impacts of certain choices by the consumer on farmers and growers. So yeah, that might be something that you value. Actually, I probably should mention that it probably comes back to your values around what's important for you in the food system. And I find that looking at the full picture can provide a broader lens on why things are or are not important. So that's in the book and in my work, that's the approach I take, rather than to say you should eat this way or eat that way. But it is a fact that some diets have a higher impact on climate change through their emissions than others.
Thank you. That's an excellent answer. And if something is in your book, feel free to just nudge us in that direction. So I'm jumping around a bit, but I will come back to earlier ones just to keep the conversation varied. Kelly Mackey says, beautiful reading. Thanks, Emily. What unique opportunities and challenges are presented in transforming the food system in Aotearoa, given our unique culture and geography, etc.?
I mean, I try and put them in the book because I do think it's our advantage. So if we think about it geographically and population size, like we don't have many people. We only have 5 million people or thereabouts. And we have a relatively big country and land space for that. We also have an amazing climate in terms of being temperate and temperate tropical in areas. So we have good rainfall in areas. We also have some beautiful soils for arable lands in other areas. And so we've got this countryscape that lends itself to being able to grow different things and diversify. We also have a low population with a high amount of available land use compared to, if you think of a country in a place like Northern Africa, right, where you're importing probably 85 to 95% of your food, importing it, right? So if we put it in perspective, we have that as an advantage. We also have a really incredible Indigenous culture, and so with a long connection to the land and a long connection to food and understanding it. And so we have an amazing history there for sharing, I guess, our food story. And we haven't done that well. We've come in from the 1800s with a very imported colonial food system. We brought in with settlers a particular way of farming and growing, and it dominated our culture and land use right up to today, and it still does. And so we also have, amazing food businesses and fisheries as well. I don't go into fisheries in my book because it's so massive that I had to keep it out for now. We have so many potential things we can learn from Māori and our Indigenous cultures and how we do that. And so I think that those are probably the most obvious strengths. And, food has been the backbone of our country forever for Māori, and then also for European settlers that brought, sheep and beef and, created butter and shipped it away, and all of those things that have happened to create the economy that we all live in and benefit off today. So, yeah, that's our situation. And there's definitely some downsides to that as well. Like, we are quite remote and we're also independent, which brings its strengths, but we're also not, hugely subsidized as parts of, as Europe is, and the States and Canada and many other places for their food and farming practices. So, yeah, anyway, all in the book. I could talk about it all day. I'll take another question.
Yeah, and that sort of, that was a nice in-depth answer, and sort of address another question around your thoughts on Indigenous kai, which I think you've answered.
Yeah.
I might jump to Dave Watson has said, kia ora, Emily, nice to hear your work. What are your thoughts around challenging the supermarket duopoly?
Oh, yeah.
Little question there.
Yeah, there's a whole chapter in the book on it. My thoughts around challenging it is that it needs to continuously be challenged until it's not a duopoly. So that's my thoughts. And there's a lot more to it. We're starting to see some small things happen there with a grocery, with the independent grocery reviewer coming in, and a few changes. So the Commerce Commission work it's certainly got a long way to go, but it's also been great that it's happened, right? So that's a start. But, there's a long way to go before we really start to see changes, I would say.
Yeah, it's sort of, it's doing what it was designed to do in some ways. There's another gnarly question. What are your thoughts on the upcoming election in regards to food system change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm currently reviewing all political parties' policies on the topic, and it's quite interesting. None of the parties have a food system strategy. So until I see that, I won't be that excited. We have ad hoc piecemeal things out there, and I have to read between the lines to see it coming close to addressing food in all of the main political parties. The topics are there across the board. Maybe if they were all in power, they might just about cover all of the issues, but not quite. So we've got a long way to go before we see any kind of, until we see food having a voice at that level. And it's complicated. Most of you who work in departments will understand that. And it's been compartmentalized for a reason, because it's complex. And as humans, we have to break things down to make them understandable. And we have to also understand that's actually a process, and that's how we can operate and be efficient in all of these things. But when we do that, we run the risk that we miss things, and some of those things that we miss are quite big and important. And so, even in your daily work, there might be simple ways that you can weave the kete back together a little bit in what you do. And that might be talking to another department, or it might be, I'll just throw some examples out there without knowing who's in the audience. But, you might, if you work in a council, you might work in the parks department. Well, perhaps you could talk to someone in the health agency, which is, in New Zealand, separate from the municipality functions. That doesn't help, right? And food crosses both. Or central government, there's many departments that touch on little bits of food. But until we all sort of sing from the same song sheet and get the purpose of the food system right, and all know what we're trying to do, we won't really make those changes. And as I say and said in the summary, the food system, people don't even think of it or know what it is yet. So this is a big part of ReFood, and the work that I do every day, Inspire, is explaining it to people and getting them to see what that looks like. Because if you see that, you might then be able to see some changes, and you might be able to make some improvements that lead to healthier outcomes for people and also our planet. Yeah.
I love that answer. And actually, your words, giving the food system a voice, is a quite powerful sort of way of reconceptualizing it. And it touches nicely into another question from Kelly. I mean, I might just read a few questions and you can kind of take the shape of them and respond, because, they're all on the similar topic. I also love that you were sort of bringing a systems lens, and your advice to people of the things that they can do seem to be in that theme of relationship and de-siloization. And I feel like sometimes we don't know what we've got till it's gone. And as we realize there's actually these negative impacts that have gone from being hours away over there that we can't see them, we're starting to really see and experience them in our daily lives. So it does feel like, as you use the word journey, it feels like a really collective journey of being with it. And while the human really wants to rush to a solution and action oriented and a linear path problem solution, it is going to be a bit more messy because it is quite complex. But maybe in that process there's going to be a lot of learning and changing the way we do things. But coming back to these questions, Kelly has asked, another great read is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. More of a Native American lens, but a very human perspective. And has her work influenced your thinking in any way? I might also just throw in a question around procurement. Janine Ogg has asked, she's interested in your perspective on procurement as a tool for empowering local food systems, and if you know any areas in New Zealand that are doing this well. So this is kind of two more for you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll respond to all of them. So for your point, Frida, I think it actually requires a lot of empathy. I think that's where I've got to after working across the food system and all the parts of it. I think that, there's not one part that's more important than the other, and we need to have a lot more empathy. And I think if we can do that across departments and parts of the sectors, then we can actually probably do a lot more. So that's my first point. Braiding Sweetgrass, yeah, I've read it. I read it after I wrote ReFood, actually. Yeah, beautiful writing and very unique perspective. Obviously, growing up as an Indigenous North American person. So yeah, beautiful way of weaving through her knowledge as a scientist with her Indigenous culture. Yes, and quite different from ReFood. I do weave my own story in there a little bit, which I enjoyed, but it wasn't meant to be about me. However, as a writer, I couldn't be separate from the food system, so I am in there, but it's not my story, and I'm very clear about that. It's the story of New Zealand's food system. It's much bigger than me. And then procurement. So yes, it's a great and effective tool if it can be used well. And globally, we have some very good examples, like Denmark is very good at procurement of supporting local food systems. So I'll use that one because it's the first one that popped into my head. The city of Copenhagen, they had a decree of a percentage of organic foods to put in their food programs. Of course, we have to remember that municipalities in other countries have different remits, and so Copenhagen remit for that municipality is retirement villages, school lunch programs, and health, which we don't really do in the same way here. But in terms of local governments procuring things, we can learn from the power of that tool. And I probably can't go into too many local examples, but the ones I have worked on in the past, I know people struggle actually to get this right in local governments. I have not worked on central government procurement of food, but I have seen the contracts that go out for large services that usually tend to end up going to the big food companies and not necessarily supporting or encouraging too much local procurement. Although when I researched ReFood, the central government procurement rules do have some things in there about where we get things from and supporting sustainability and things like that. So whether that plays out in practice is a different point, but it's definitely something that should be considered because, you know, the purchasing power, you think of all those meetings, all those cheese scones that get ordered, and all the food waste from not procuring accurately. But it's deeper than that, right? Like there's more that can go into it. So I think we could do better there. Each of these questions is like a whole section in my book. It's really great.
Yeah. There is a lot of knowledge out there. And I think sometimes these questions are putting a lot of a load on you, and it's not like you've got this magic bullet answer. But I think the process of having this conversation has huge value that, you know, so I'm just going to keep reading. We've got, I don't know, sort of 10, 15.
They are the best questions I've had in a ReFood presentation. So thank you to the wider audience, of which I can't see any of you, just little circles with initials. But I'm sure behind each of those circles and initials are really wonderful people. So thank you. Keep going.
That's great feedback, and feel free to put your cameras on, people. So Katarina Tutau has asked, how do we make the change between the costs of kai when it's cheaper to buy and eat unhealthy kai compared to whole organic food? How do we start that ball rolling?
Yeah, it's such a meaty question, and it's so important. So the highly processed, imported, cheaper food is that way for a reason. It's come from the global food supply chain most of the time. It's been produced in countries it's been produced cheaper in other countries at scale, and that makes it cost less, for want of a simplification. And it's done en masse at highly efficient levels, which means that, you know, can produce a lot of it and ship it off around the world. And then meanwhile, the alternatives, which tend to be, you know, healthier and things like that, can come at, if they're grown in New Zealand, we've got pretty good labour laws, and we could, well, it's tricky because it's all relative, really, right? So in this answer, I'm comparing it to the global in that context. Nationally, we could always do better, of course we could, but compared to other countries, we pay our people quite well. We have pretty good labour laws, and we produce food at a very high quality. And our farmers and growers are really good at what they do compared to other countries. And we have a pretty good supply chain. I mean, we have gnarly country roads and we use a lot of trucks. We don't have efficient freight with rail, or we don't really use sea that much or that well anymore. We can and do use it, but it takes longer, so people want it faster. Anyway, that aside, we do produce food at a top level. So these requirements, like these costs and regulations and things, they cost our farmers and growers, and that cost goes into the food, and then that comes back to the people trying to buy it. And it's a very, very complex question, actually, and I do try and unpack it in a simplified way, but there's more to it. The point, though, is that I don't think people should be completely put off by this concept. I think that it's not available to everybody, but in some areas there are people that are growing food for things like community-supported agriculture parcels, or supplying to markets and farmers markets where it is actually just as affordable as other options. And I don't think we should, and that could be also the fact that we're in a 36-year price hike, right? But it's not only that. I think that it also is something that I come back to time and time again in my book, and that is that we need to really simplify what we're trying to do. If you want to have a meal every night that replicates a chef in a restaurant somewhere, or you want to have the best ingredients that are produced so that it looks like that, then yes, it's going to cost more, especially if that's out of season. But if you're actually happy to cook a hearty veggie soup in the middle of winter that will last your family for 4 or 5 days, then believe me, you can actually make a meal for under a couple of dollars of organic fruit and vegetables. Not fruit, you probably don't put that in your soup. Some people do, but skip that. Vegetables. So, there's different things. There's different ways of doing it. And I think food literacy comes into that. I think there's also a bit of snobbery around food. I think people, as consumers, see things like organics as kind of like rich white people buying it. So, and it's true. How do we actually shift it so that we make it so it's not this kind of just a certain segment that needs to have access to that food? I think there's a lot more there. I could actually talk about this all day. I just feel like there's many sides to this, and I think that we've got a lot of work to do. And I think maybe now I'll just say a few examples of how we could support that. So if we support our growers and our farmers so that they can also supply food that's grown well regionally to people, then we can actually bring some of those prices down. And so you can support initiatives that pop up in your community for, produce and things. But also we have to remember that certain things we haven't quite got at scale that we're growing in New Zealand right now. Like, for example, rice or other foods that actually we do import, to feed people. But I think if we support our growers and farmers, and I think we can do this in New Zealand, but it's just going to take a little bit more work.
Love that. You've sort of answered a question earlier about, Agnieszka Boron, Aga, hope I said that right, asked, what's one thing we can all do to encourage good change? And I think you kind of just spoke to that. And as you were speaking about the duopoly, I was thinking about wonky box and things like that have popped up. And so it's when these initiatives do start in the community, to support them is going to give your energy to a more virtuous loop.
Yeah, and things like Soupy, which is a great example. I mean, she set Soupy up to specifically address the issues that we're talking about, and reduce waste and these things. So there's a lot of examples out there, but that's okay for people that are in paid jobs and able to look for these things. But really, we have a whole different conversation that we need to have if we really want to address issues around affordability and access, actually getting the food to our communities. It's a much bigger problem, and many of you will be working in this in your jobs right now, will be understanding the nuances of that. Like, it's a much bigger challenge, and it's tied into more than just the food system. Of course, it's tied into the cost of wages, the housing crisis, the state of the global economy, the zeitgeist. There's many things that come into it. The food system is just one system that's at play here.
I love that you've clearly got a really, really broad awareness of the big picture, and I think we need people with that awareness to draw our attention to where the effectiveness can be when they're feeling overwhelmed. Because I think as we're sort of waking up to these realities, we do encounter overwhelm and despair and hopelessness. And I actually went to a talk last night with a climate psychologist who said, we have this narrative of, okay, we've got to build hope, we've got to build empowerment. And yes, we do, but we don't have to villainize hopelessness and despair, because actually, if we're just like, that's a feeling we're having for a reason, it can become quite a positive phase in that journey. And I think you've touched on a lot earlier, you sort of said it comes down to our values. So I think with all these questions, that's such a powerful reminder of knowing what we value. And if we can act from that place of seeing that need, which you clearly are to a massive degree, it's enough. And it's sustainable, because we're not coming from a place of a really strong emotion that can narrow our lens.
Yeah,
I mean, precarity.
I talk about that being your sphere of influence, actually. And that we often have two hats, especially in food, because many people will have, obviously themselves to feed, or maybe themselves and a family, or flatmates, or whatever the living situation. And so that's your one hat, and if you own the biggest food company in the world, you still have to eat dinner each night and understand that. And so I think that that's actually one of the amazing things about the food system, is that every single person is connected to it, and where you come into it can be many, many different political or social or cultural things, but ultimately you're connected by the food within it. And so the other hat you wear might be that, during the day you work a job that touches on the food system somehow. And so that's why I think there's a lot of power in food as a way of change. And there's a lot of hope there too. There's a lot of really great things, and I think those are the things we should focus on. The advantage of a global food system is that we can learn from the mistakes of others, and we can also be inspired by the wonderful things that people are doing to help solve some of these problems. And technology and global connection allows us to learn from that. And many of the amazing initiatives that have popped up across our country in the last 10 years have come from that. In fact, myself, I do that. I'm connected to a global community of food system change workers, and we share this information and learn from each other and try and make the good things happen through that lens as well. So I think that it needs to be framed in a positive way, but you also do need to go through the overwhelm to get there. And that's okay. You can, as I say in the book, you can sit with that for a little bit, because it is uncomfortable, but that's what change is. And then come out the other side with hopefully some positive steps in your job to do something a little differently. And if you can't do it in the workplace, then you can do it in your consumer purchasing power, if that's a privilege that you have, which people probably on this call are paid people in a job, so they probably do have that privilege. It's obviously not the case for everybody, and I need to acknowledge that.
I love that. We are sort of getting to the end of time, and you've sort of touched on the last few questions that people have popped in the chat. I'll just share one more. It's probably what we've got time for. Caroline said, what is the role of supporting each other to grow more food for ourselves? And Eva has sort of said, so how do we educate? She's like, yeah, I love eating healthy food. I love soup, but I have boys. They complain they're not full. We need to go to school, community groups, local government. So everyone's busy, and we tend to go for convenience.
I mean, my sphere of influence is to communicate and educate, and I've chosen to do that through my book and my work. And so I'll just, speak to that. And if it's about getting the word out there, then, even sharing the book. On Sunday night on TV1, not TV1, sorry, Sky One, the Prime Sky thing, there was a doco that was screened, and that actually was touching on quite a few issues that I touch on in ReFood. So there's also, books aren't for everybody, but there are podcasts and there are docos out there that are looking at these topics. So that can also be a way to educate people. And I think, without overwhelming our education system, which gets, thrown everything to try and solve. I mean, I see some great things in there, just as a parent with children, and how much they're ready to learn, and, things like Garden to Table and great initiatives that happen across the country. But, that's small, and education actually starts with yourself. So, yeah, I feel like that's where you can start all of these things, and then that might spread further out. So yeah, thank you for your time. Kia ora Tegan, I just saw you there pop up. Nice to see you. Yeah, thanks for your time, Frida, and for collating those questions. I loved them. I kind of had a feeling there would be a lot of questions, so I'm glad that we left a good chunk for that. It's definitely easier to go into what people really want to hear about. I really encourage you to buy my book, of course, and to support New Zealand nonfiction and independent writers, which we all need that, but it's not actually about that. I mean, I wrote the book to change the food system, so you can help me do that by reading it or sharing it with other people, encouraging people to learn more about what we're talking about, and then hopefully through that ripple effect we can create some big changes. And keep up your regional work, the food strategy, Tessa and others that are involved in that, and some of you who I might have already talked to about it. Yeah, let's keep that going too.
Thank you so much, Emily. I just think, yeah, you're being so effective at giving the food system a voice, and I'm just grateful to you for your work and your advocacy and your mission. And this was one of the most popular webinars that we ran, with a huge number, over 100 RSVPs, and I think that speaks to people's values are in the right place, and it's just going to be that gradual change. So I'll make sure to promote your book, and just a huge thank you. And people can find Emily at www.spira.nz, and maybe even sign up for your course. And
oh yes, thank you. Maybe I should do, I don't know if it's the right forum, but I will just say that.
Yes, do.
Well, I mean, I've talked about my book, right? But I'm a food systems expert. I run Spira. I train people and facilitate difficult conversations on food systems change across all sorts of organisations, central, local government, industry, health groups. Some of you I've trained and you've heard from me about this topic. But on World Food Day, which is October the 16th, I have an online course called Food Foundations. It's a 6-week professional course, so it's for people working in a job that's related to food systems, and it's a cohort coming in to improve and understand deeper our food system, and then apply that to a project or work that you have, so that you can chart a pathway forward, coached by me. And usually the other people in the group are pretty amazing and also help you connect and have that journey. People often say it's the other people that are involved that they learned a lot from. So yeah, I facilitate that as well. So there's a lot going on. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm actually really approachable, as you probably gathered. You can reach out to me and ask questions. And if you want to do that course and you think you're not sure if it's right for you, maybe just send a message or connect through Frida, and I can have a chat with you, a 15-minute conversation or something. But yeah, keep up the great work, everyone. Lovely to meet you, and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Emily. Ka kite. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.